Hello and welcome again to Deploy Friday, the Platform SH web show, where we talk to interesting people about cool topics, or sometimes cool people about interesting topics. It's kind of a toss-up which it'll be. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Shawna Spoor, from our accounts team. Shawna, say hello to everyone.
Hello.
Today, we'll be talking about the recent release of Composer version 2. For those not familiar with PHP, Composer is the PHP package manager. If you've used NPM or bundler or pip, same thing, but for PHP. Our guests today are the two main authors of Composer and of Packagist.org, Nils Ederman and Jordi Boggiano. Do I have that right?
Boggiano, yeah.
Okay.
We'll take it.
I'm an American. My accent is never good. So, guys, tell us a bit about yourselves. Who are you? What do you do? Starting with Jordi.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Jordi. Hi. I mostly, these days I mostly maintain Composer and Packagist.org, so the open source version of Packagist. Yeah, that's my main job, let's say.
Okay.
Nils? And hey, I'm Nils. I too help maintain Composer, but at this point, kind of more as an expert for a few particular areas that I'm still very knowledgeable about. And most of my day is actually spent running Private Packagist, the company that we set up together back in 2016 to try and finance all the work hours that we put into the open source project.
Cool. And we'll be getting back to Packagist.com a bit later. So to start with, Composer, Packagists, for those who are not already familiar with them, what are they? What are we talking about here?
So like you said, Composer is a package manager, or as we like to often refer to as a dependency manager, which is responsible for installing and managing the different versions of dependent packages that your project that you're trying to run has. So you define a series of packages that you'd like to use, which in turn have their own dependencies, and they all have to kind of say which versions am I compatible with, and then Composer is responsible for figuring out which of these versions are all compatible with each other, for downloading those, for sticking them in the right directories, so that as a developer working with the PHP project, you can kind of just use all the code that's in those different libraries without having to think a lot about where and how does that come from, and how does that end up on my machine, how does that end up on the server I'm going to run this application on.
All right. So Composer is the client part and Packagist is the server part, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So we kind of try to make that a bit clearer from the beginning on to avoid some of the confusion that way back when existed with peer in the PHP world. But you've seen some of that, like, for example, the JavaScript world with NPM. If you refer by one name to both the server side, like the thing where the packages are registered, where you're downloading them from, as the same as the command line tool that you're using to download them, then if another command line tool, for example, comes up and is more interesting, like Yarn, let's say in the JavaScript world, suddenly it's a bit unclear. So like, am I using Yarn with NPM, but I'm not using NPM? So like, which part are we talking about? And so to avoid that kind of a confusion from the beginning on, we wanted to make it clear that Composer is the command line tool, or potentially the code inside of it that can be used as a library for integration into some web service. And Packagist is the server, the registry, the repository for packages that you can download.
The irony being that, as far as I'm aware, there are no other front ends to Packagist. There's no competitor to Composer the way that there is in the JavaScript world.
That's true so far, but theoretically that's possible. I think it's just it also made it a bit clearer. For example, when people build these like front ends, like UIs that may use Composer as a library or with code, but that have that don't use the standard command line interface that we provide, they're still talking to Packagist, the server. And I think even in context like that, it helps a bit distinguishing between what's the service that you're contacting and what's the local tool.
Yeah, and also one thing to consider is we do have several, let's say, backends or like repositories. because you have packages.org for the open source stuff, you have .com for the private packages, and then you have several ones like Drupal has its own package repository, and Magento as well, and so on. So actually, there's competition in a sense. I mean, it's not really competition, but
there's more back server implementations than
right
implementations, which is odd. Okay, so what exactly is the origin story for Packagist/Composer? I remember hearing this at one point, then there was a Korean restaurant involved. Beyond that, I don't remember the details. So fill us in just briefly. How did you end up in this role?
I guess the Korean restaurant part was in Paris at the at the SymphonyCon or Symphony Live back then. So there's this like main symphony conference where we were both at, and through different interests, let's say, we kind of both ended up there and both interested in solving this problem of package management, and that's the short version, I guess.
So I think for me it was kind of this background of PHP plugin systems, like forum software, like building some kind of like end user application that has a plugin system that's written in PHP that needs some way to install these plugins. And I think for Jordi working at an agency at the time, I think it was more like that kind of concept of like Symfony and Symfony bundled, and how do you install those for different applications. And so we just discovered through mutual acquaintances who ended up bringing us together at this Korean restaurant that we both had kind of a strong interest in this. And started talking more about that, and then eventually started actually working on this project together.
Cool. So Composer has some unique features. It was not the first language package manager on the market. It's not the most recent, but there's a lot of things it does really well that other packages don't. The one that jumps out to me is the way it handles automatically releasing packages with tags, which most other package manager systems require an explicit step. I really like that as a developer. How did you end up with that decision? Are there any other things you feel you just really nailed in the design of Composer or Packagist?
I think that was kind of just the idea of like making this process as simple as possible, and then taking the fact that in the PHP world, usually what you run is actually exactly the source code. Like you don't typically have a build process, or like you don't need a build process for libraries. Sure, like for the actual application that you might want to deploy to your servers, typically there's some kind of a build process, but for libraries, it's just you take the code, like it's like a script language in that purest sense. And so it just kind of seemed natural to not have to intentionally involve some kind of build step for libraries. And if you decide that you don't need that, it actually makes the process much simpler for a developer if they don't have to manually package up something and push it somewhere. But if all they have to do is mark a version in their Git repository, and Packagist just notices that and automatically makes this available. So I think it was just the natural way to implement this once we decided that we didn't need any extra build steps in between. And like you, I agree that this is actually part of what makes Composer really comfortable, easy to use. Like you don't have, like there's just one extra step that usually if you use package managers, you have to figure out. Like if I want to publish a library, like how do I build it? Where do I build it? How do I actually publish it or something like that? And with Packagist, all it takes is you have a URL to some public Git repository, and that's it. You don't need anything else.
Jordi, anything that went really well, you think?
I would say the other thing that I run into regularly when using Yarn or NPM, which is kind of the other one I'm mostly exposed to, is the log file. And even though Yarn does have a log file, for some reason it works in a way that I cannot comprehend. And I'm not sure where it's going wrong, but it seems impossible to simply like run an install and have something that you're sure is going to be what's in the log file. And that I find insane, that we're still in a state where like this is not, just commodity at this point, because the idea is not crazy, like it's not complex. But for some reason, it seems like most other package managers just don't care about this, and I find this actually so convenient. So
Yeah, I think that's something that just mattered to us a lot. Like having like a developer tool should be very predictable. I mean, we too made mistakes with that and things that we've improved. But I think just overall, that's something that we agree on, that like the tool should behave in a as predictable way as possible. That I don't have to sit there and think, why the hell did it do this? I don't understand, and like I have to read docs for a couple hours just to understand what is going on. But ideally, after having you'll always have to have read a bit of documentation, get like a basic understanding of what this is supposed to do, but then there shouldn't be any of these major surprises that it just does something entirely different from what you would expect based on what it previously did. So I think that's something that we always try and focus on with the command line interface.
The way I usually describe it, and the way I haven't had anyone disagree with me on this, the two package managers that people don't complain about that actually seem to work correctly are Composer and Cargo for Rust. And everyone else, someone has something to complain about, but those two seem to be the most thought through in my experience.
I mean, thanks very much. I do think people complained a lot about the performance of Composer and the amount of memory it used. So there's always that one thing.
That, yes. But it's not like that's a unique complaint to Composer. See also all the jokes about NPM.
yeah.
So you mentioned not everything was perfect. What do you think are some of the mistakes that you made in the initial Composer packages design?
I think I can maybe start with something that, just based off of things we've improved in Composer 2, actually, because I think that's the easiest way to think about this is, what did we think was so bad that we had to make major changes? And for me personally, it's actually a lot about it actually has to do with this predictability thing and the log file that Jordi mentioned, where I think over the years we developed this very clear understanding of of how this dependency manager is supposed to work, which works together with this whole being easy to understand or do what is expected, which to us is mostly this two-step approach of I have a JSON file and maybe some utility commands like Composer require remove to modify this JSON file, which defines which packages do I want and which versions. Then I have a command that's called Composer update, which takes me from the JSON file with metadata on the internet to a composer.log file, which lists specifically all the packages I actually want in specific versions rather than a range of versions that are compatible. Just as a list, and then there's a Composer install command that takes this file, goes down the list, and installs them, meaning downloads those files and sticks the files in my vendor directory. So it's kind of just there are two files and there are two steps. Right? There's one thing that synchronizes the log file with what's in the JSON file with whatever is available on the internet. So if there's new releases or something, then the output of this command is different in the log file. And then there's the other thing which takes the log file, which is just a list of URLs basically, together with the content at those URLs and creates a vendor directory. So I kind of have these two synchronization steps, I guess you could think about them. Mm-hmm. And while this idea of having an update and an install command that kind of worked like this was the case very early on in Composer already, originally we started off from, I guess, the idea that we had about package managers more from Linux distributions or so, where it's kind of a way to modify your system, right? You install one particular package and then your system has some new state, and then you go and install another package and it modifies the state of your system. And here that intermediary step is missing. You don't have this log file thing in between. And the huge upside of the log file is a way to get the same state onto different developers' machines in a team, onto your production systems when you deploy, without having to actually ship all of that code that's referenced in there all the time. And that's not something that exists in this Linux package manager world. But because we started out thinking about it like that, in Composer 1, the update command that's supposed to generate the log file, for example, starts by reading what's currently installed in the vendor directory, because it tries to be smart about not reinstalling things that are already installed. But the actual effect this has, that in some odd edge cases where you have multiple developers with their own machines all running Composer update, with different states in their local vendor directory, you end up with different metadata for the packages in the log file, depending on who did the most recent update, even though the versions are supposed to be exactly the same. And then this log file just keeps changing around, which kind of exactly what Jordi said is like, that's not what the log file is for, just because some local state changed. So I think that's one of the mistakes that I think we made in Composer 1 that we now finally addressed in Composer 2 that's caused a lot of confusion over the years, that was definitely responsible for quite a few bug reports. So I'm glad that we finally managed to clear that up a bit better.
So what else in Composer 2 should I care about as an end user? If I'm still running Composer 1, tell me on updating.
I think the easy one to care about is performance. Like, it's just so much faster and uses so much less memory. Like, there's no, I mean, the numbers vary a bit, but it's like more or less 80% reduction, let's say,
Damn.
in runtime and memory usage. So, like, if only for that, I would say everyone should upgrade, because it just makes it much snappier.
That's a good argument.
Yeah. The rest is kind of, a couple nice little features here and there, but at this point, things have been going on for so long that it's, the key stuff is there, right? So
I think if anything, it's more of these small iterative improvements and making error messages better to a little more understandable, giving better hints at what you may want to look at if there is actually kind of a version conflict. And I think that's a bit to do with the refactoring that I just kind of explained, how we made these steps clearer. As a consequence of that, you also immediately get a way to present errors better, because it's just those steps are clearer in the output, and then as a user also you kind of understand this process better, and it's more like it just helps you work with the tool.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think the problem that you had talked about earlier, not a problem, but an occasional bug that you would experience with Composer, where you would have multiple developers working on a project and suddenly updates were coming through, you couldn't get the Composer update to work. That was a really common problem for us. And we weren't that big of a team, I think 6 to 10. So I think people are going to be really excited about that. But with that in mind, like that for me is one of the problems that Composer had, was like a big scary thing for me with Composer, when I was like, oh no, I have to commit a change to the Composer log file. I wonder what's going to happen. So is there anything like that in Composer 2 that you guys know about, or maybe bug reports that have come in so far that we should keep our eyes out for when we move into Composer 2, if you move into Composer 2?
So I would say that there are not. I mean, we definitely had a few bug reports since the release. That's like that was to be expected. But I think at this point, like it's really as stable, and I would say more stable than Composer 1 is. So I wouldn't worry about doing this, like about upgrading. The other big thing you have to keep in mind is that you can try to upgrade, and if things don't go your way, you can always just do a git checkout of the composer.log file and kind of reset it to the way it was, and like there's no risk really. So yeah, I think like the major hurdle at this point may still be the plugins. So if you depend on plugins which do not yet support Composer 2, this might kind of keep you stuck with V1 for the time being. I think the list there is getting shorter and shorter. I'm not sure. Like, it kind of depends what software you're using. Like, I know Magento, for example, announced they would release, I think next month, a version of Magento 2.4, I think, with Composer 2 support. So that's coming there. But if you're using Symfony, it's been supported since last summer. I don't know. Like,
I know.
I think that was really the reason why Composer even had a version 2, is that we wanted to do all this refactoring, and we had to make it a version 2 because there are some DC breaks. And so while we try to make these as small as an end user as possible, because I mean, we didn't really want to change how you interact with the CLI. Like the commands are still the same, the options are all still there. What we did have to change is the interface that plugins interact with. And so there are plenty of users who don't use Composer plugins at all, and then for them this is the smoothest transition ever. But there are quite a few projects that depend on plugins in some way or another. And unfortunately, often even without like the end user necessarily knowing about it, because they often do relatively small things somewhere in the background, and they're just a dependency of a dependency somewhere. And so I think that's part of why, some people are just blocked by this and they can't really do a whole lot about it by themselves. That said, in nearly all cases, upgrading a plugin to be compatible with Composer 2 is also really straightforward. So like Jordy said, I think at this point, the majority of all plugins actually have a compatible version. So worst case, you'll just have to upgrade that plugin package and then you should be good to go.
Okay. That's a good segue. And a lot of people don't realize they're using Composer plugins. It's not a commonly understood part of the ecosystem. What are some other lesser known features of Composer, or specifically Composer 2, that people may not realize are there, but should or might benefit from?
I think one thing that's, I guess maybe become increasingly known over the last months, years too, is the whole concept that we have of different environments that you interact with. And this started out with just a few small tricks here or there to make Composer install on a system that maybe doesn't support a PHP extension that the project actually says it needs. And I think at this point, it's actually a pretty well thought out system that you can use to build on different environments, make sure that what you create, or what you install with Composer is compatible with the environment that you're executing it in. And so I think what may not be known to everyone is how to kind of use all these steps together in the best way. So there's a few components. There is a thing called the platform config, or rather config.platform, I guess, or like the subsection in the configuration in your Composer JSON, where you can define parts of your platform. And by platform, I mean a section of Composer that defines a list of packages in the Composer sense that represent your local system environment. So that's PHP extensions, that's the version of PHP itself, that's a couple of build flags, like if you have a 64-bit or a 32-bit system, etc. And all these become available as regular Composer packages to depend on. So you can write a library that depends on a particular PHP extension or on the fact that it's all running on a 64-bit system. And now the reality might be that you're trying to build a project for your production environment that's still using an older version or something like that on your dev machine where you just upgraded. And so using this platform definition in your composer.json file, you can say, hey, actually install the packages as if the PHP version was still this older version. And it'll resolve them taking that PHP version instead of the one that you have locally installed. So that's the first step. But then the next step is actually, you can kind of accidentally then also end up doing this in reverse, right? So you have this in your composer.json file. You kind of forget that this is there because it always just works smoothly. And then at some point you decide, all right, we're upgrading to PHP 8. Our production system is now on PHP 8. My local dev machine is upgraded to PHP 8. And then I still run this. But there's this thing in there that says, config platform PHP 7.4, and it all goes through smoothly. But now when installed a package that's not actually compatible with PHP 8 at all, because like a newer version would be needed for PHP 8 support. And I don't notice this until I deploy my code into production and it all falls apart. I mean, maybe I have tests and maybe it falls apart there, but there's going to be that step. And so there's another command in Composer called check platform recs, like check platform requirements, which you can run after you've done your installation, and that'll verify that the local environment actually matches what you've installed. So this is kind of, I think, the command that I'd say is like something that's not known well enough that people should be running more, is check platform requirements, which verifies that what you've currently installed actually works on the system that you're trying to run it on.
Yeah, I know I've run into both benefit and issues with the config platform section. We maintain a whole bunch of templates for different PHP applications running on Platform SH, and building those involves doing a Composer install multiple times in a script on my laptop, which has one PHP version and does not have all of these other extensions installed. But then we deployed a platform where the config file says, sure, you can install Mongo, install Redis, install this, install that in whatever PHP version. And I've often run into issues where like I have to pin the PHP version, modify the upstream's composer file to pin a PHP version or something like that to end up without a broken install because then my environment is not the same as the production environment. So there's probably a lot more there I could be using. I have to look into the Composer 2 features there, I guess.
So I think a key part of this is that generally the easiest way to resolve any of these issues is for your development environment to match your production environment as closely as possible, which I guess is advice you'll get in a lot of places. But of course, that isn't always an option, right? But just generally saying you don't need most of these things if you can actually make that happen. And I think that's part of the reason that people like working with Docker these days, that you can have the same containers running in all these different environments. But yeah, if like you are forced through this, there isn't like the one right answer necessarily for how to do something like that. We try at least to provide enough of these features to make that kind of work possible. But yeah, in the end, this does involve a bit of reading docs and kind of figuring out under this combination what effect do I actually want to accomplish.
Yeah, I'm definitely
not straightforward
here.
Speaking of PHP versions, curiosity is going to get me on this one. So you've kept support for 5.3 in, and I just think that's really generous. And I'm just wondering, like what drives the decision making around, like what versions of PHP you're going to support? Because you're supporting 5.3 and 5, and both of those are deprecated and old. So just wondering.
Long dead.
Yeah, long dead. We're still writing like array as an array without the square brackets, so that's not fun. So definitely, like the main reason was not our personal enjoyment, I would say. It's really to make sure that everyone can upgrade to V2, because we don't want to maintain V1 forever, and especially we don't want to maintain the packages.org infrastructure that supports V1 forever. And so it's just being able to say that, there is an upgrade path on the client side. That means that, once we shut down the infrastructure on Packagist, you don't really have a good reason, let's say, to complain, because you should be able to migrate to V2. So I think that's the key point to me. That said, yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, it's just more like, I think the general answer I always give to the lower PHP version is just, what's the tool that you use in order to upgrade to a newer PHP version? Well, Composer, because you need to upgrade your dependencies to support a newer PHP version. So if the very tool that you're using to get to newer PHP versions doesn't run on your current PHP version, you're kind of in trouble. And the only thing you can do at that point is use an older version of Composer, and then we get back to what Jordi was just explaining about how we don't want to maintain the network protocol, the server side part for Composer 1 anymore.
So there's a new protocol between Composer and Packagist as well?
Right. Yeah. That was kind of part of the speed improvements as well, and memory usage as well to some extent. But so just to wrap this up about PHP support, I mean, definitely we don't want to support PHP 5.3 forever, because at this point it's complete insanity. I mean, it's just. And we're seeing 5.3 is I don't remember, 0.2% of usage or something. I mean, it's really not a major part of the user base.
Composer is more generous on its versions than WordPress, and that's
right. So the goal, or the plan, let's say, is to release a 2.1. I'm not sure when that's going to be, in the next few months, I guess, with a few more features. And that would be kind of like an LTS version for still 5.3. And then from 2.2 on, we would kind of drop everything under 7.1 or 7.2, still it kind of depends how the stats look by the time we get there. But the goal is that by the end of the year we should have a 2.2 that drops like everything below at least 7.1. So
Okay.
and then the other one will still be maintained. Like 2.1 would still be maintained for like critical fixes and so on. But that's feasible, let's say. But maintaining V1 and V2 in parallel with all the refactorings we did is just a massive pain. Like it's just not sustainable.
Okay. Yeah. If anyone watching at home has questions, go ahead and ask in the chat. We will repeat them here.
So just to follow up on that whole thread of like writing array instead of square brackets, like what's the composer development process like? And I know you have GitHub, which is where your issue queue is, and you have a lot of contributors. So what's generally the process for you when it comes to planning and then actually building?
The planning is very much ad hoc, I guess.
The open source way.
Yeah, it's probably like that in most open source projects, except maybe the largest ones that kind of have more resources to put in this. So I think it's usually kind of wishful planning. Just have a vague idea of what we want to do and then put it in a milestone, and then it gets done when it gets done, and that's about it. Like as far as workflow goes, I would say community contributions tend to be also like fairly ad hoc. That's also like just a thing of open source that like people don't come and do what you want them to do. they do what they need, and it's completely fair. So on that side, I would say it's very unplanned, and stuff just comes by when it comes by. And then our work is a little bit more targeted, probably at the bigger, let's say the bigger picture that we want to achieve. But
how much of the development is from the two of you versus contribution? I know some projects are like 99% the author's doing everything. Others, the author spends most of their time just reviewing pull requests and never actually writes code anymore. Where does it land for you?
I think the best idea you'll probably get yourself if you look at the stats or something on Composer, because I think it's kind of difficult to really give a concrete answer on that.
Yeah.
So go ahead and say what you wanted to say. How much of your time do you spend writing code versus reviewing pull requests?
That also varies widely, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's from time to time. I think in the last few months, like leading to the V2 release, we did have quite a bit of contributions, because there was a few people who were excited about the release and kind of helping us get there, and that was nice. These days, it's calmed down quite a lot, I would say, and it's mostly me doing bug fixes and like. Yeah, but we're also kind of in this phase where we're just trying to stabilize like V2, and then we'll get back to new features soon, I guess.
Okay, so there is a significant amount of drive-by contribution, essentially.
Yeah, I would say there's quite a bit of that. It's usually small stuff. Like there are a few people that got involved in like bigger topics, but it's like the barrier for entry, let's say, is quite high sometimes, like depending on what you want to do. So
I think the project is just something that's, I mean, you have a few factors that make it like tricky to come in and contribute significant parts like quickly, that are the number of like use cases, environments this tool gets used in is so vast that any time you try and build a new feature, there are so many things to consider that you will never have seen yourself from your own experience as a developer, because those use cases and situations really only exist in particular environments that other developers work in. That's something that just makes it difficult to kind of submit a pull request for a new feature that actually can be merged as is. And then the other part is that there are parts of what Composer does that are just relatively complex in what it actually accomplishes. And so those things are just difficult to get into from a technical perspective and to really understand like how these things all affect each other. A lot of that again has to do with the level of performance optimization that we've had to do there over the years. And things like now in V2, every all network being parallelized, for example, that's usually not something that makes code easier to follow and understand, but rather the opposite. So yeah, there's definitely some hurdles to just having people come in and contribute major parts.
Are you using Guzzle for that, or did you write your own parallel? I guess you can't use Guzzle if you're supporting 5.3.
Yep.
Oh boy, oh boy. One of those things that gets the change in 2.2.
Yeah, that's maybe at some point we'll switch to an external client. But I mean, there are two aspects to this. One is indeed the PHP compatibility, but the other aspect is also that we do need it's just stuff that's going to be used everywhere in all these various environments. And in my experience, third-party code has rarely been tested to that level. And then you start using it and stuff breaks, and then you start to have to end up contributing back to that project and end up sort of maintaining that as well anyway. So I would say if we have something that works, it's like the incentive for us to switch to something like Guzzle is not super high.
I think another aspect that always kind of stops us from adding more dependencies than we really have to is again something to do with how PHP/Composer works. And that if you ever try and execute especially Composer plugins or any code that actually runs in the same scope as Composer, you're always bound to the versions of the packages that we have in Composer. So if you have a Composer plugin that's written in PHP that just runs within the Composer process, and you try and use, let's say, Guzzle, and you have your nice new version that you want to use, but Composer is still using an older version because we're trying to support PHP 7.1, then your plugin can't actually use that newer version because our version of Guzzle is already loaded. And so with every dependency in Composer that we add and that we use, we actually tie every plugin to the same version of that package. And that gets even some plugins actually do load quite a bit of application code, for example, and this just keeps getting worse the more dependencies we add to Composer. So that's generally something we shy away from a bit if it's not really necessary.
And since it's distributed as a FAR file, that means you can't if you have that problem in a Symfony app or a Drupal app or something like that, you can update your own Composer file and try and update the dependency version. But since Composer is a FAR, you really can't do that when you have the dependency literally bundled into the package.
Well, then again, there too, it's a bit of an issue if you need to use Composer in order to upgrade these dependencies, and if those aren't strictly compatible, it's just very doing that would just be a very risky kind of thing because you kind of easily get into a point where the only way to really get back is to re-download Composer FAR or something and actually reset the whole thing. So that's generally not something that I think we want to move, a direction that we would want to move in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it is weird that, ironically, the package manager cannot use dependencies. Well, I mean, we do a bit, but
yeah. So what dependencies do you have? Third-party dependencies?
It's just a few Symfony components and a couple things that essentially were part of Composer, but we extracted out at some point. So it's very, very little.
It does use the Symfony CLI component, correct?
Right. Yeah, it's console and the process component as well, and the third one, which I can't recall right now. I think it's only 3 or 4 Symfony components and then kind of internal stuff.
Okay. So, Jordi, you've spoken in the past at conferences I've seen you talk about the challenges of managing open source projects. Some of those are very entertaining presentations. If you're watching at home, I recommend looking up some of those videos. They're quite entertaining and not always family friendly. What would you say is the biggest challenge of managing like one of the top 3 projects in the PHP ecosystem? What's unique about managing a project like that, more so than say Monologue, which you also are, I think, still responsible for?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess like what Nils mentioned, kind of this thing about having so many environments, and it's just, it makes it really tricky, because you do need to keep all this information in mind always, and like I mean, at this point I've really learned that any change I do is like most likely gonna break something somewhere. Like it's just, you don't know at the time exactly where, but it's the trauma is very much ingrained. Like it's kind of
the XKCD cartoon, if the CPU overheating is how I trigger this other thing, please stop. Don't the overheating problems. Like, what are you doing? You actually have that.
And I think to give people an idea of like what kinds of stuff we're talking about, maybe just like some random examples. Like I'm thinking of the whole, like how somebody came out with the way to restart Composer if it detects that an Xdebug is enabled. I think with newer versions of Xdebug, that's finally not really necessary anymore. But for performance reason, I don't know what the current state of that is and like how far Derek got with that. But basically, the problem was always that Composer ran very slowly if you have Xdebug installed, which makes sense because it kind of like has to hook into everywhere, and Composer just does a huge amount of function calls that kind of all gets slowed down just a little bit. And so somebody came up with a way to kind of restart Composer inside of itself with all the same configuration, is that or just like restart the PHP process, but without Xdebug. So it kind of like takes all your PHP configuration, rewrites it into some temporary directory, and then starts the PHP process like with that temporary configuration that it took from the current process, like something like that. And then you have to be aware that because of that, like, I don't know, the process you're inside of may not actually be like the process that the user originally started, and things like that can actually have weird side effects on like other areas where, I don't know, like you're trying to interact with like a terminal or something. Or I don't know, like the kind of code that or the weird way how password inputs work on Windows, for example, where there's actually an additional like an executable that you need to have that allows you to enter passwords without them being visible on the terminal, which I believe is like a bit of C# code, if I remember that correctly.
I don't remember.
Like
C++ or something. But it's like 3 lines of C code, but you cannot do this in PHP, so you need the exe file to actually be bundled and just execute that.
And this is like just 2 random examples out of 100, right? And so there's just lots and lots of these things that all kind of in weird ways interact with each other, that if you forget about them, make things kind of difficult.
Fun times.
I think just like moving files around, and then you realize that on certain file systems, and depending on whether the target and the destination are like on the same partition or not, there are like weird issues on a particular operating system, and so you have to do something different in a particular scenario. And like, I don't know, just lots and lots of these types of scenarios.
So does that mean you have 3 different computers, a Linux, a Windows, and a Mac just stacked next to each other on your desks?
No, we just push out releases and hope for the best. No, I mean these kind of things. It's usually you kind of like you fix it, and then you have a helper function somewhere that does stuff in a bulletproof way, and then you just use that, and that's it. Like that's just don't change the thing that worked at some point, and then you're good. But yeah, it's problematic that at some point, like 5 years later, you just don't remember exactly all the details of why this and that is specifically that way. And then sometimes, like when someone wants to change it, you're like, I just have this feeling like it should be like that, but I can't articulate why anymore. So
that's what comment blocks are for, that describe the terrible system you're trying to adapt for, so you know which terrible system you can forget about when.
Yeah.
Some of my code comments have been.
I think even if there's a comment, you feel like at the time you wrote a really good explanation about how like a particular type of proxy setup, if it like uses SSL and it does like this and that, and that's because you like now you have to actually redo like the SSL handshake yourself in PHP because it's on 5.3, and like there's like this random thing, but then you wonder, but couldn't I also have done this, like, if this other variable was set over here, and like, but that thing isn't actually comment, like, like the comment is already that long, and but like the one detail that have a question about, like, that's something you never even considered back then. Like, so either maybe you never even thought about it back then, or that just seemed like so obvious at the time that you didn't leave a comment for that. So I think even though you'd leave comments for these things often enough, like, there was so much detail in there that, like, the one thing that you're looking at 5 years later is what you can't actually infer from the comment anymore.
The worst
and I
developer in
think
the world
hearing
months ago.
Yeah, I think hearing all that is like shocking. I don't think you really think about everything that goes into it. And Marcus has a YouTube comment that just says he wanted to thank you for the monumental contribution to PHP that Composer is. I think every PHP developer can echoes that sentiment. And so, did you guys know what you were getting into when you started this?
No.
Is it possible to know?
Yeah, that's a hard nope. No, I mean, like, I think next month, or is it in April? Or yeah, no, I think it's in April is the first commit or something, and it's like there's gonna be 10 years then, or 11 years. I don't even remember this one. No, I think it was I think it was 2011. So yeah, at this point it's been like 10 years of writing this stuff and maintaining it and this and that, and no, like definitely did not imagine they would even last that long. I mean, yeah, that's like the where do you see yourself in 5 years, but
not here then. You didn't see yourself in 5 years back then here?
Nah.
I think the other thing was maybe as we started originally we had like very different reasons to be interested in this. I think originally we didn't even set out to necessarily build a tool that's just for PHP generically. I think it was basically like build something that helps with, I think, Symfony 2, the beta versions were just out, and maybe make something like PHP plugins possible. And sure, if it maybe helps a few other projects along the way, that'd be cool. But I think only gradually over the course of that first year, it became clear that this was going to be a tool for PHP in general. So, I mean, that already kind of changed the whole perspective on what this is. And then, yeah, like Jordan said, I don't think either of us realized this was going to stay around as long and actually get to become such a core part of so many projects.
But you have managed to make it sustainable, it seems. And we mentioned at the beginning, you now have Packagist.com, not to be confused with Packagist.org. Talk to us a bit about that. What is it? Is that private Packagist just with a new name? Is it an extension of? What does all of that look like?
Right, so Packagist.com is private Packagist. Yeah? So that's the product that we sell on there.
Okay.
And well, like the name says, it's kind of the same thing as what Packagist is, just private, right? So it means you have your own repository of PHP packages, which can be all the ones that you internally develop in your company. Like the goal is to make Composer easier to use and more comfortable to use as a business. So if you have internal packages that you share amongst projects and you don't want to put these on Packagist.org, Composer does have a few ways built in to deal with private packages, but they have a number of downsides. And so private packages makes this a lot more convenient. One typical issue, if you try and directly include private Git repositories, for example, is that it becomes really slow the more you add, because Composer will have to actually directly deal with Git rather than having an optimized protocol for Composer, like what we do with Packagist.org. So private Packagist does the same thing, and it just kind of handles this in the background. And then additionally, we have features that kind of help you depending on the organization of your business. So in the PHP world, there are a lot of agencies that actually operate on a model where they have different clients who they develop projects for. And so in that case, you typically have packages that are developed just for one client, and you don't want other clients to have access to that. But you may still have other private packages that you as an agency reuse across projects, but you still don't want to open source them because they contain some kind of private information or like some code that you don't want to make public. And so private packages actually has a a way to separate this into separate subrepositories for each of your client. So you can select like which packages should be available to which client, which of the packages do you want to make available to all of them. And then at the same time, it mirrors all the third-party code. So open source packages from Packagist.org, or if you're using this with Packagist.drupal.org, for example, so that you actually end up with all your packages in a central repository. So in your projects, you only ever include private packages with Packagist.com and your composer.json, and you just turn everything else off. And that has a few upsides. For one thing, just because of the way that our architecture works, usually this speeds everything up quite a bit. It also limits the repository, of course, only to packages that are actually used in your organization. You can actually then do things like reviews. So before you add new open source dependencies to your organization, you can actually review them that like the license is something that we're okay with using in our business. And then manually add them and make them available for developers to require in their projects. And you have a way to browse through all the packages that are used in your organization. And just like on Packagist.org, you can kind of see what other packages are actually using this thing. You get a similar feature within your own organization. So you can find out, oh, so there's this library, this open source library even, that we're using. So which of our packages are using that library? And then you can kind of look at that and see which of our projects are actually using this internal library. And you can kind of find out information about the way that you use PHP packages within your company. So that's another upside of the mirroring. But then also it protects you a bit from issues. Like I think there was this somewhat famous case in the JS world where somebody deleted an open source package. I mean, that's just something that can happen on Packagist.org, sort of in the same way. So we have a few protections in place for people to just not randomly go delete stuff. But in the end, somebody owns that code. And if they decide this is not supposed to be on the internet anymore, they can delete it. And so then it becomes kind of a question of how, like, if you as a business depend on this package being available to keep operating, you kind of want to make sure that you have a copy of that. And I mean, some ways to recover that is typically maybe you have a composer cache somewhere where like at least you have a copy and then you can kind of fork it or something like that. It's an open source package. But with private packages, just becomes a bit more natural because you have a copy of every package because you mirror them and you don't have this type of risk anymore. Apart from,
if I could dive into that a bit. So
Sure.
Packagist.org doesn't mirror the code itself, just the metadata. Yep. So if I'm installing something normally, it's going to hit Packagist.org, get metadata, compute things, and then go to GitHub or GitLab and actually download the code from there.
So the way that you can think about the composer update step, which takes metadata and it downloads that from Packagist.org. And then into the log file, it writes a list of download URLs, which are in 99% of cases for open source code, github.com. So composer install then just loads stuff from GitHub. Okay. And in the Packagist.com case, we do actually keep copies of all the files that you're downloading and you're installing them from private Packagist.
Okay.
And well, at least over the last year, where GitHub had a few issues here and there, we actually have like significantly better uptime availability and download performance because GitHub also is not primarily just a code host. So like you download the files off of servers that aren't necessarily very close to you. So even that step can take a while sometimes. So that's another upside of using private Packagist.
Okay, so there are advantages to private Packagist. Even if I'm using all open source code, I still would benefit from just routing it all through Packagist.com.
Well, I think the main thing to mention if you're just using open source code, apart from like the upsides of mirroring I already discussed, is that last year we also introduced security monitoring. And so while there are quite a few solutions available at this point that automatically monitor PHP projects for security issues and dependencies, the way that we've integrated this with the other features, I think makes it really convenient to use if you're a company that mostly does PHP development, where we'll notify you about any security issues we detect in your dependencies through the composer.log files in your projects. Because we have all of those mirrored, we know exactly which packages you're using, and so it's very easy for us to identify exactly which packages you may want to get alerted about. And then you can kind of configure this, whether you want to just get an email, get this on Slack or Microsoft Teams, or there's a generic webhook thing available as well.
Okay. Very cool. Now, I don't want numbers. I'm not going to ask about numbers, but is this business model working? Because sustainable open source is always a challenge. Is the private packages model successful? Are you still? Does it look like it's going to be successful? How is that looking out?
So I think the simple answer is that yes, it is working. We have over 500 companies as customers at this point, quite a few large ones amongst them. We're a total team of 5 people at this point, including the 2 of us, who are mostly working on private packages, but once in a while also help out with especially Packagist.org infrastructure, like sharing some of the things that we learn on private packages across. But it helps us actually spend time on the open source project, which was the goal. And we do get paid for that now. And while I think we have lots of space to still grow as a company and get more PHP companies to use this, and I think they'll benefit from it, it has definitely gotten to the point where something like Composer 2 has really only been possible because private packages exist.
Yeah, as a PHP developer, I'm very happy to hear that you have a sustainable model to keep working on Composer. It's kind of important these days.
Mm.
So what's the pricing model like for Packagist.com?
Just a user-based pricing, which we do because at least it's somewhat easy to understand, model, predict, because you know how many developers you have. And so it's 14 euros a month for each developer who has access to the system. So that in a company typically isn't necessarily every single developer, because if you have a bunch of people who are doing more like front-end stuff and use Composer only to install from the log file, they don't all have to register as paid users. But in the end, yeah, it's the number of developers you have who actively work with Composer, I think.
Okay. And does that include like a machine user, like if you're on platform?
So you do, So you do additionally get read-only authentication tokens, which you can use for free. That's the same reason why, like, if you have somebody who's just running a Composer install because they want to set up the site as they work on some CSS, they too can just use these free read-only tokens, and then mostly they're meant for your deployment machines, for your CI, etc. And you just get additional tokens, which you do not have to pay for.
Okay. All right. Well, Shawna, do you have any other questions for anyone at home playing the home game? Right. Nils, Jordy, any final thoughts, final comments?
Just please, everybody, upgrade to Composer 2 so we can turn off Composer 1 on Packagist.org.
Yes.
Save us a major headache.
Yeah. I think I just updated my laptop to Composer 2 earlier this week, and you can run Composer 2 on platform. We have documentation for it. You just add 2 lines to your platform YAML file, and we will pre-install Composer 2 and then run everything else with Composer 2 after that. So it's not our default yet. It eventually will be, but you can definitely update yourselves automatically. We haven't updated our template files to do that yet. We might want to look into that.
Please do.
Just to be nice. All right, I guess that's a task for me then. You're giving me more work here.
It saves you CPU time as well, right? So
true.
It's a win-win.
We'll have to look into that. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jordy. Thank you, Nils. Thank you, Shawna. Thank you for those watching at home. This has been Deploy Friday, hosted by Platform SH. Next week, we'll be back. Otavio Santana will be here along with me talking about business automation using the Quarkus microframework for Java. We have a pair of guests here from Red Hat to talk about what business automation means, how you do it. Is it just called code? We'll find out. Tune in next week for that. Same Friday time, same Friday channel, because Friday is an excellent time to deploy because you're on Platform SH, so it's safe to do. That's kind of the point. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.